This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. The Wheel Fiddle, written by Roger Ley, performed by Chris Herron. The melody drifted across the garden as she was picking fruit to make a summer pudding. She put down her basket, wiped the sweat from her forehead, and walked around to the front of the cottage. The man stood waiting at her garden gate. He raised his cap. He had a strange, stringed instrument tucked under his arm. There was a small metal handle sticking out of its base. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I've a raging thirst, Mom. Been walking half the day. I'd be grateful for a cup of water." He was a down-at-heel-looking character. His clothes were worn and dusty. He was probably a laborer seeking work, still strong, but lean and weather-beaten. She turned and walked back up the path to the cottage and gestured him to follow. "Sit there on the garden bench while I get you a cup," she said. In the kitchen, she poured the water and cut a piece of the cake she'd baked for her husband the day before. When she came out, he took the cup and plate from her with a sigh. "My name's Tom," he said as he bit into the cake. "Tom Buckland. What's that contraption at the side of you?" "It's a wheel fiddle, Ma'am. Some call it a hurdy-gurdy, or you earn an extra shilling here and there with it." "Well, you can sing for your supper, then." He smiled to himself. "I can do that for certain," he said. He finished the cake and picked up the wheel fiddle. "Can I see it?" Alice asked. She held the old instrument with its strings and levers. It was scratched and chipped, but its ivory inlays and brass fittings hinted at its once having been beautiful. She stroked the curve of its body and handed it back to him. He settled it onto his lap, turned the crank, and fingered the keys. A strange, wailing melody sounded. He began to sing, in a higher voice than she was expecting, and in a language she didn't recognize. Goose pimples rose on her arms and legs. The fine hairs on her spine stood up, and the feeling flowed up her back and onto the top of her head. The traveler's dark brown eyes watched her unblinkingly as the song continued. Her knees turned to water. She sat down on the close-cropped lawn and lay back. The swifts and martins dipped and dived, racing and turning across the sky. She closed her eyes. Waking suddenly as she heard her husband push open the garden gate, she could tell from the light that time had passed. There was no sign of the traveler. The plate and cup were neatly stacked on the bench. "I thought I heard music," said her man. Alice stood up and brushed the creases from her dress. "Music?" she asked. The baby was born next March, during lambing season, an inconvenient time for a shepherd's wife to be birthing a child. Her mother used to say, "There's no good time to be having a baby," and she was right. A sensible shepherd stays away from his wife in July, and so her husband had. But he never spoke of the birth date. After all, July was a long time back, and it was hard to be sure. As the baby grew, it had his brown eyes and dark complexion. Alice called him Martin, for the birds nesting under the eaves of the cottage last summer. Martin grew to be 10 years old. He went to the church school and had the adventures that country boys have. One day, he was running an errand for his mother to the village shop when he heard music coming from round a bend in the road. He stood listening. Presently, a man appeared. His clothes were shabby. He was holding a strange device and cranking a handle as he walked. This was the source of the music. He stopped when he reached the boy and looked down at him, closely. "Would you like to try?" he asked after a few moments. They sat on the bank, and the man showed Martin how to press the keys and wind the handle. "What's it called?" he asked. "It's a wheel fiddle, boy, and you're a fair talent for it. So, keep it. I've no use for it no more." The traveler stood and continued on his way. The boy barely noticed him leave. The eerie music seemed to play itself as he walked slowly back to his parents' cottage. His mother came to the front door, ashen-faced. "Where did you get that thing?" she snapped. "A traveling man gave it to me. He said I'll have a talent for it." And he carried on playing. She felt the magic of the music once again, but she was older now, and the resonance was weaker. But still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "We'll have to see what your father says about it," she said sternly, but then softened after a moment when she realized that the boy's father had already had his say. The Wheel Fiddle is one of the stories in Roger Ley's speculative fiction collection, Dead People on Facebook. All the stories in the collection have been published, podcast, or broadcast in the last year. Roger also recently released a brand new techno-thriller novella called The Muslim Prince. It's an alternative history that hinges on futuristic surveillance techniques and what might have happened if Princess Diana hadn't died. It's available on Amazon Kindle and has been given good reviews on both Amazon and Goodreads. Links in the description. Hey guys, Roger Ley strikes again. I'm amassing quite a collection of Roger Ley stories on this show. If you'd like to hear them, I'll place a link in the description down below where you can hear them all in one place. So, what did you think of this story? It reminded me of old fables, like those recorded by the Brothers Grimm. Before you leave, be sure to subscribe. This show is available on YouTube, Facebook, and just about every podcast app available. I'm Chris Herron, and that's it for today's Tall Tale TV.